Okay guys, we're here in very hot and humid Brisbane today. Economy picking up a bit, lots of apartments being built outside. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Brisbane's doing well. There's a lot of activity going on here. It's riding on the back of a bit of a pickup in commodity prices and perhaps a bottoming in the mining cycle. But the problem I think that you guys can talk about is there too much of a good thing? Are we building too many apartments here in Brisbane, and will that cause problems down the track?
I think Pete will answer better than I will, but I think yes. I mean, but again, you know, it's a changing phase. It's a subtropical city. It's hot. It's not like Sydney or Melbourne. There's 3 months of the year, and it's hot. Not just hot, but wet and sticky. So, yes, all construction, all activity has to be welcomed to a degree. But I do think, you know, that are we building the right dwellings? I don't know, it's a moot point, but that's what I think. That's my...
Well, Dan, I know you've just come from Newstead, good case in point. Lots of generic investor type dwellings, building a lot of the same type of stuff, but not necessarily what people in Queensland want.
So, like, I mean, this is the thing. Growing up here was Queensland. You'd have this beautiful... Maybe it's a sign of the times in terms of, you know, like people want these kind of... They want a unit construction. They want the inner city living. I mean, my humble view would be that there's still... It just seems that, like, you know, why settle for something, you know, that was built maybe 10 years ago when you can have something which is fantastic. The price, the rents aren't really going anywhere beyond $400. I know for people in Sydney, that's a dream and a bargain, but they're not going beyond that point. So that's how I would say.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's not all bad. And people talk about Brisbane apartments in negative terms, but it's actually forcing some of that decrepit older housing stock. People need to actually improve it to get it on the rental market or hand it over to home buyers.
And one of the other good things, and this is Brisbane specific, but it's also Australia wide, is that we do have really strong population growth. The demographics are supportive. So, okay, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a problem in the short term, or maybe that even lasts 12 or 24 months where there is this oversupply. But given both the external migration to Queensland and Australia, plus interstate migration from down south up to this southern corner of Queensland, you'd think that in a couple of years' time, with another 100,000, 150,000 people, even if there is a bit of an oversupply, the risk of a glut right now, it won't take too long for that to work its way through. I'm not saying that it's going to happen quickly and there are not some risks, but the demographics in Australia and Queensland remain really positive and sort of just guard against that risk of a major crash or a major decline.
I mean, I come back to one thing, is that, you know, you want, if people are moving up here, are they moving up to establish new businesses? What type of jobs are they coming up here? I suppose that it's always those follow-on questions. You know, you build all these apartments, right? Then you actually have to find a way to move people around. Those challenges are unique in this country in terms of they're everywhere, and I just don't know if we're addressing them as well as we could, but, you know, again, moot point.
Yeah, I guess as you said, a lot of it comes back to jobs. I mean, Queensland seems to be going into a synchronised upswing, not just Brisbane, right across the state. I think it's, as you said, partly coal prices are back up, but whether or not we're creating the full-time jobs in Brisbane, different question. There's a bit of infrastructure going in, but yeah, some question marks there, no doubt.
Yeah, and of course the national economy will be important too, and it's sort of might be a bit premature to talk about this. I'm sure we'll touch on this a lot later. But you know, what's the public policy response here? What's happening in the national economy? What's going to be happening, you know, from our political masters in Canberra? The budget's only a couple of months away. I know we're going to touch on that a little bit later, but we've also got this discussion about monetary policy and interest rates. Obviously, a critical important both for owner-occupiers and investors. You know, the jury's out about how the RBA is going to be managing this current cycle. They've been on hold for a very long time. Will we have another 12 or 18 months when they're on hold again? And how does that impact demand for property?
I'm going to stick my neck out and I'll ask the question. Should they cut? I personally think they should, because there's just...
Well, I've got a lot of feedback, sometimes abuse even from some friendly people. Look, I think they should have cut a long time ago. You know, you look at, and one of the reasons I mentioned that is the inflation performance. You know, we got the CPI numbers a few weeks ago confirming yet another quarter where the inflation rate's below 2. So they've missed their target for over 2 years now. And also back a couple of years ago when the rest of the world, or similar countries to us, Canada, the UK, the US, Eurozone, had interest rates at or near zero, or even negative, Some of them had QE, quantitative easing. We kept our rates at 1.5. The Reserve Bank was paranoid about housing bubbles, so they didn't follow the cutting cycle. And that's sort of facilitated our underperformance. But then you look at what's happened in unemployment in the UK, the US, they're 4 point something.
Right.
They've achieved something. So now they're starting to unwind this sort of very aggressive monetary policy. We didn't do it. So in a sense, did we make the mistake of not following? We've had the currency being up at the 80-cent region, give or take. You know, the export numbers sort of not doing all that well. So I reckon they should have cut, but I still think they might if we get another couple of quarters of low inflation.
I'm going to turn into moderator man here, but Pete, I'm going to put it back to you because, you know, if the RBA, the central bank, was to lower the benchmark, would it really have a material benefit? I mean, like, it's kind of like, I mean, that prices in Sydney, that's a very segmented area. You can't compare the east of Sydney, let's say, to the rest of it. I mean, there's already enough kind of demand there. I don't know if...
so what's your argument? Monetary policy doesn't work anymore?
I'm saying at this point in the cycle, like, I mean, the price is already very high. I don't know if that'll be as effective.
Look, people are, we tend to look at these things in terms of the housing market. And I guess there's a housing market commentator. People always think I'm arguing for lower interest rates purely based on that. But as you said, we've got low inflation, there's an output gap, unemployment. We're probably jumping ahead a bit here, but what about all the underutilisation in the employment market? I mean, it seems to me there's obviously not much appetite for lower rates, but maybe the point will be forced upon the RBA if we keep underperforming.
Yeah, well, I think it might be a good time to talk about underemployment if we may, because again, that's been the issue, and we've seen it. Just the recent labour force numbers came out, and while we've had terrific jobs numbers, the headline employment creation over the last 18 months or so has been fantastic, there's no question. But has it made that impact into lowering unemployment? Well, barely, because we've still got 5.5 unemployment rate compared with 5.7. So it's welcome to have a lower unemployment rate, but it's not really impressive. The underemployment rate's still above 8%. And the other curious thing in the data, which is starting to just sort of feed into some of the commentary, is that the hours worked series, which is actually the truest guide, I think, of the labour market performance. So if everyone's got a job but they're only working 30 hours as opposed to everyone's got a job and working 40 hours a week,
that's right.
Yeah, that's a big change in how the economy is performing. But we've had this, the hours worked per person dropped to a record low in the most recent numbers. So while the jobs numbers are good, there's still plenty of slack in the labour market. And then you only have to just verify that by looking at the wages numbers, which again are continuing to bounce around this 2% level. They're very, very low. And that's telling me there's no tightness in the labour market.
Well, if you want to look at it, I love looking at it state by state. If you take New South Wales out of the equation, there's no major mainland state which actually has an unemployment rate below the national benchmark. They're all hovering at 6. So, you know, you're obviously the biggest employer, biggest state, but but Victoria's 5.8, and I know the state series are a horrible, you know, highly volatile, but the simple fact is there's labour market slack, and that goes back to my point about cut the rate, send a message, start investing, you know. Be prepared to wear a 30% tax rate, but if you're a business, employ some people, but just get things going, because ultimately there's just nothing going on. That's how it feels.
Now, talking of tax rates, big news story this week. Emma Alberici, ABC News, piece originally posted on corporate tax and then taken down. Gents, thoughts?
Oh, look, it's I read the article and I've read it several times now, and I couldn't find any factual errors. There's issues of nuance, like there often are in all news articles. It's the things that were chosen to be included that were important, and it was a fair assessment. It was a fair commentary on the company tax issue. I think it's important when we've got such a big ticket item. Company tax cuts are going to be costing the budget $65 billion over the next decade. It's a lot of money. So if we're going to do it, the onus is on the proponents of it to say, well, why it's such a good idea. And all that Emma was doing was just sort of highlighting the fact that for whatever reasons, the tax law, she didn't accuse anyone of breaking tax laws or anything like that. No. She just said our current tax laws have allowed, I think it was 1/5 of companies not to pay tax for 3 years. And that's a fact. And that's because of either they didn't make money fair enough, or they had previous losses which they carried forward, or they had a pretty aggressive capital expenditure which they had as depreciation, so they didn't pay tax. So I think it was a real pity that the article was taken down, because at a time we've got the budget in a couple of months, the company tax issue will be obviously at the centre of the budget. I'm sure that Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Morrison will ensure that it is. So let's have a really fulsome debate, have people criticise the issue of why her article might have been wrong or contestable because of saying they are advocates of lower company tax rate, but just base it on facts. And I thought it was really disappointing.
So opinions are going to differ, but the piece should be up there for debate. I sense, Dan, you're thinking the same thing.
Well, look, I was a former data journalist, so I do know a thing about numbers, and look, you don't want to tell a national broadcaster how to conduct their affairs, but in this case I will. Back your troops. Apart from the fact is, this is not an article which should be taken down. If anything, it should be stirring debate. I don't know Emma Alberici personally, but she's a highly experienced journalist, very thorough. She should be allowed to at least defend that piece. And I thought it was pretty innocuous, some of the things that she's been criticised for. I mean, I saw the Finn went holes bowls at her, but at the end of the day, she should be allowed to defend that, her piece, and is well researched, and she's got, I think, that they should always back the troops. That's one thing I'd say. It's pretty deflating when you don't have that.
Pete, what was your view?
I suppose my view is, yes, there's some opinion in there, but isn't media supposed to be about debate? Now maybe we're conflating different issues with tax avoidance and tax losses brought forward, but at the end of the day, we should be having those debates. Now clearly, corporate tax, a policy much debated, election looming in the not too distant future, coalition struggling in the polls. This may or may not be part of that. Now obviously a lively couple of weeks in politics.
A frisky couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's straying into dangerous territory now, but what are your thoughts on opinion polls? And I mean, coming election, we've got different other tax policies, so capital gains tax, yes, negative gearing, always widely debated, and these are potentially issues that are coming right into play now.
And just possibly income tax cuts if the Treasury update that they get in the lead up to the budget is confirming what appears to be a better bottom line for the budget. It appears as though funnily enough, the company tax take is actually going up on the back of the commodities boom. Look, I think the tax debate is an important one. Unfortunately, there's one big item that's not on there, and that's the GST, because both sides of politics are so absolutely scared about discussing it because it's seen to be, and probably is, political poison. So what we've got on the coalition side is the company and probable income tax cuts. Are they affordable? Is that the best use of money? Labor, on the other hand, will probably allocate that money in the heat of the election campaign to health and education, but they're also going to partly fund it by changing the negative gearing laws and limiting it to new dwellings, not established dwellings. That's going to have a real material impact on mood and sentiment in the housing market. And of course, the capital gains tax concessions will have another influence on whether it's a good financial planning strategy to use negative gearing to buy a property. They're going to be hotly contested issues for sure.
It'll be refreshing to talk about policy. Yes. I'll just say that. I mean, if you look at the broad politics of it, yes, strangely, like we'll call out the elephant in the room. It's obviously what's happening with the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, but that sucks that sucks everything off the front pages, and when you've got disunity, as John Howard often used to say, is death, and we're not reform weary, we're reform hungry. We need to change course in this country. I mean, and at the moment, it'd be great if we got that conversation. I do think tax cuts and these things are admirable. I suppose a question I'd have I'm going back, but can we afford it? I mean, I don't know. I mean, love your opinion on it, but I don't know if we can actually afford it.
Yeah, well, as Stephen said, maybe an improving bottom line, but it's still a deficit, and those commodity prices have been quite favourable for a year or two, but they can always roll over.
They're more dependent on Chinese government policies these days. They say,
policies.
They say, we've got too much pollution this week, so we're going to reduce the number of mines operating in China, and then no demand at all And the prices just skyrocket. Then they're trying to say, well, we're back to something different. So,
and as someone who's actually seen the vagaries of forecasting budget numbers, good and bad, at the moment the budget projections in my EFO have a smallish surplus in 2020-21, that financial year. So it's sort of it's there and thereabouts. So there's a small surplus penciled in there, but that's still basically 3 years away, and all it will take for that number to be blown out of the water will be nothing to do with income tax cuts or company tax cuts or negative gearing changes that Dan, as you just alluded to. If the iron ore price is $10 a tonne lower than is currently forecast, if the wages growth numbers, which they're actually pretty upbeat about, come in, let's say, half a percentage point lower, so nothing terribly bad, or no GFC, no recession or anything like that, but just if some of those parameters are slightly different, that 2021 surplus will be gone and pushed back another couple of years. So I think I'm all for tax cuts, but when you can afford them. Let's lock in a couple of years of surplus before we get serious about talking about.
We talked a bit there about data or data and analysis and how you interpret it. Dan, talk to us a bit about what you've been up to. I know you have experience with Bloomberg, but it's been a hot topic the last year or two. We've had the census fail, budget cuts for the ABS. Now, I personally think the ABS does a wonderful job. I love their releases. They cop a lot of flack unduly in many cases. A lot of sometimes I think misinterpretation of seasonally adjusted figures, original figures, trend figures. I think they cop a bad rap unnecessarily sometimes. But talk to us a bit about what you've been up to and what kind of problems can you solve for people.
Well, so I left Bloomberg, left on great terms. Naturally, want to pursue my own thing. I've created a website called Data Digger, and actually feeds in a lot of not just the ABS data, but the RBA, all the commodities data. What it allows to do. So, for example, if someone's not necessarily proficient in a spreadsheet like your good self, it allows people to filter what they need. So, if it's seasonally adjusted, if it's trade, employment data, if they want to see part-time versus full-time, they can do it, and a chart will come up. So, essentially, I suppose you're trying to impart what I did as a data journalist and an analyst for a long time, and allow people to have their own views. And of course, I'm quite active on the social media, which I allow. So I love interacting with people on the charts, but so often people say, "Oh, I don't know where to find it." So that's what I've been doing. So and I think there's a market there for it. So log on.
Yeah, that's right. It's a growth industry. There's more data out there, but there's more appetite, I think, for interpretation. I mean, Kouk obviously is someone who is quite a well-known face in forecasting, obviously getting access to the right figures on a timely basis. That must be stuff that's
user-friendly basis too certainly helps too, because there's the thing, and we sort of touched on with the Alberici article too, the argument's got to be based on facts. And so when I come out there with some of my comments and some of my thoughts and some of my analysis, I always endeavour to, and I think I always do, I'm pretty sure I do, have a fact behind it. I can't say that the unemployment rate is dreadful unless I can actually point to something, or the labour market's soft, or inflation pressures are only evident in the non-tradable sector or something. How do I find that out? You've got to scout around to do it. So I think that's the issue right now. And as we know, the hotly contested issues on monetary policy, or they are just rates, as we've discussed, the budget, these sort of things, they're the sort of stuff that you just need to get the meat on the bones to sort of form your views. And when the data changes, you're allowed to change your view.
Look, and so often, one of the things I used to find all the time was, as I said, people, you want this information in a timely, manner. And again, you're right. I love the ABS in terms of I think they cop a bad rap as well. And I think it's. I think one of the things which hasn't helped them, of course, is that they endured some terrible budget cuts under both sides. And
yes.
And I think if you're going to the one thing with a good statistics agency, and not just, but when you've got clean data and good data, then that informs debate. And so my number one goal with this was. It was really kind of in reaction to a lot of people who would often speak to me going, where do I find this data? And I think that's kind of part of the big question which I'm trying to answer with Data Digger. Naturally, you move from the corporate world to working for yourself. That has its own challenges, but it's certainly something I've embrace, so to speak, as well as a teaching hat as well.
Great. We look forward to that. So 2017 was obviously a massive year for jobs growth, and not all of it part-time, lots of full-time jobs being created. We've touched on some of the key issues, but what else do you see as a big key issues for 2018 and
2018,
beyond?
gosh. I don't want to focus on housing, but it is a big issue, both in terms of the construction cycle. We've already discussed Brisbane, and there's some, while the monthly numbers on building approvals are choppy because of occasional big apartment projects being approved or not approved, there does seem to be some topping out in the construction pipeline. There's still a bit to go through. So how rapidly will the new construction activity slow down? That's important for bottom line GDP. But of course, prices do matter, and there's some evidence coming through that the falls that we've seen in Perth and Darwin because of the mining slump have now been mirrored, if you like, or replicated in Sydney, where there's pretty strong evidence that its prices are weakening. So for the moment, that's good news, because prices were crazy. The RBA and the regulators wanted to achieve it with their tightening in interest-only loans and loan to valuation ratios and all this other stuff that they've put in there. But like many things in life, be careful what you wish for, because there's this risk, and I'd only put it at a risk at this stage, that if we do see house prices falling a bit more, let alone a lot more, then some of this reasonably optimistic tone that we've taken earlier on could be dashed. So housing will be a really important indicator for me about the risks to the markets and risks to the economy.
I mean, a lot of it, Dan, I assume, just comes back to, if you can't get access to money, then house prices aren't going to go up. And I know APRA's been tightening. I mean, we talk about these median prices in Sydney of 1.1 million plus for houses. I mean, people aren't saving that money. That's that's equity plus borrowings. And if APRA is tightening up, particularly for investors and interest-only loans, as you mentioned, if the access to finance isn't there, then that should naturally cool the market, you'd think.
It would, but I love that APRA banking data report, as you well know. I think if there's one report which...
You're a man of simple pleasures.
I think that is and it gets no love, but it gets plenty of love from Data Digger, I'll just say that. But anyway, outside of the thing which I suppose I look at is the lending to business. And there's just not, the big four lend almost the same amount to the business sector as they do for investment property. There's not, as I said, yes, housing is a big kind of, I don't know if it's got much more to go than it currently has, but I suppose I just look at the two things. Where are the jobs and the industries coming from? And people say, Australia's got this great services sector, but again, it's just falls into these constant themes that, gig economy, there's nothing kind of really taking up the void, which is, I suppose, and it comes back to that big word of confidence. I mean, even though those reports seem to be somewhat stronger, but I just don't know where the next boom industry is for us.
Infrastructure, or what else? You guys will know more about this than me. It's an interesting point you mentioned there, business lending. It's talked about a lot. RBA's credit aggregates every month. The business lending isn't, it's lower than housing lending. How important is it? I mean, I know as a small business person, and you guys too, that often business loans are secured against housing and therefore often categorised as housing loans. But of course there are other ways that businesses raise capital as well. Primary, secondary markets for small businesses, it's often family loans, savings, so business lending maybe not as important as it seems, or is it?
It is. I think you've summarised it really well, but I still think it's important for perhaps the bigger projects too, that one of the issues that a lot of the bigger corporates have, of course they borrow directly from fund managers and the like through the corporate bond market, all that's it's been doing okay, but the question is, do they have the confidence, again, even though we know that even business interest rates are at record lows. Again, the RBA do, in their chart, they have this wonderful chart on actual interest rate paid by both small and big business being lower. So is there another hurdle for them to borrow more to expand? You think about any big business sector, little businesses always want to expand. big businesses do as well. So what's stopping them from hiring more people, spending more on CapEx, these sorts of things? One is how the economy's performing and do they have a product that people are going to buy? The other one, of course, is the interest rate, that old hurdle that, you know, if I can borrow money at 5%, I'll do it. If it's at 8%, I won't. So and this comes back to the earlier question on monetary policy. There we focused on housing interest rates. That, you know, an interest rate cut would actually help the business sector as well, and maybe these. I'm going to say green shoots in the business investment cycle will turn into something more substantial if we were to get that rate cut that we're speculating about.
I don't recall the exact figure, but the property cycle in Australia has been wildly impressive in terms of seeing all these cranes. But it just goes back. But again, you know, like a lot of businesses, you know, like they often, other thing too is, I mean, when I lived in Hong Kong, you know, of course they're tied to the US benchmark, but like you could get a personal loan and the interest rate is, you know, infinitely lower than what it is in Australia. And I think, you know, just that there's also a fear factor, like, you know, this, you know, like that businesses will be rejected. They're not as credit worthy as someone looking at a house which is bricks and mortar. Yet, and therefore you've got some competition coming through there. But I think there's a perception there that big banks just don't want to lend to small business, and I think that's more, you know, perception based than anything else.
Well, let's push the boundaries a bit here. No specific financial advice, of course, but you talked about the housing market looking toppy, maybe some concerns about negative gearing or CGT breaks being wound back.
Sure.
Question I get a lot from people: okay, I want to invest today, but the US stocks look very expensive. If they go down, we go down. If you've got a 5-10 year outlook, what do you invest in today? If it's not property, do you look at global stocks? Do you look at Australian stocks, which arguably have been less overvalued but still have had a good run, or do you do something else?
Gosh, always the hardest questions, but I'm still a fan. I think our stock market has been massively undervalued, and I look at it from the perspective of things like negative gearing, things like the actual performance of the various indices. You know, the ASX is still 10-15% below what it was 10 years ago. Now, we have very high dividends, and there's the franking credits, which sort of distort that a little bit compared to the US market. But anyone who put their money into housing, other than perhaps in Perth and Darwin, has made a massive outperformance relative to anybody who had a share portfolio only. They've had a fantastic outperformance. And the amount of money lent for investment purposes on dwellings is what, 600 billion, something like that.
Yeah.
The amount of negative gearing on shares is about 10 billion. Nobody negative gears shares, even though you're able to.
Is that because of the rise of CFDs? Like, I know margin
possibly.
loans are hugely popular.
Yeah, and you don't get margin calls on a mortgage.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in 2006-07,
yeah.
we were all geniuses in the resources sector. We were all making a mozza, and then of course when the market rolled over, a lot of those loans called in, and as far as I can see from the RBA stats, margin loans have never come back. But
no, they haven't.
Is that CFDs or is that other? Is it Bitcoin?
And I think it's just people don't want to. People fear that, and people don't buy an underperforming asset. Now, markets underperform not only global stocks but also the property market. So, look, I'm thinking that maybe our stock market does a little bit better. Obviously, just dependent on the banks and resource sector. So you're making a call on that. But also property from a 10-year view, which I think you've got to view property investment, either the one that you live in or invest in, has to have that sort of time frame. I stand corrected, but I don't think there's been any 10-year rolling average on house prices where you've lost money.
No, not that I know.
Now, doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's a pretty good investment, as we were saying, with demographics and these sorts of things still being positive, even with the negative gearing changes if they were to happen.
But I would always say as the housing market person that Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne have had an amazing run, but some of the other markets not so much.
Oh, indeed.
I think Brisbane, very patchy market, a lot of high-rise apartments, but some of those more established markets maybe not quite so.
And who'd have thought Hobart?
That's right. I remember talking about this with David Scott. He was in the Clock Hotel about 3 years ago, and he said we should all rush out and buy houses in Hobart because Chinese interest. He was on his third schooner by this stage. I took it with a pinch of salt, and yet here we are 3 years later, and we're all looking.
And Scuddy's the prophet. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
question for you. Like, we talk about the capital cities. What about the Gold Coast?
I always thought of Gold Coast. I think with the Commonwealth Games coming up, the lower dollars help tourism. I think it's going to be a good run for the Gold Coast. Vacancy rates have really tightened since 2007, but that is a speculator's market. You've got to be in and out at the right time, because the sky is literally the limit when it comes to new supply. When apartment prices start rising, bought by politicians or otherwise, the new supply is very responsive, and we know those are the riskiest markets. Look at mining towns, look at fringe housing estates. The most supply responsive markets are always the riskiest, and it's even more so the case with apartments because of that lag effect. So the period between when you buy and when you settle, I would say probably a good run ahead for Gold Coast, but be careful what you buy. Buy something that's appropriate for a home buyer, not a holiday apartment, because when the economy tends to crap, second homes are often the first things to go.
Yeah, and in fact the RBA did a nice piece. I think it was Lucy Ellis, the Assistant Governor, put out a research note or a speech last week, and it showed how consumer spending on essentials, no surprise, is remarkably steady come hell or high water. Spending on discretionary items, holidays and the like, is the swing variable in what we spend our money on.
And holiday apartments.
And that's right, and that's exactly the point I was trying to emphasise.
Okay, well that was one of my key planks of my investing strategy, which is Gold Coast property.
Oh no. buy high, sell low.
Yes, race horses, because that's where the magic millions are.
Yes.
And of course cryptocurrencies, which have made a bit of a fight back in recent weeks. But I tell you what, no, on a very serious note, cryptocurrency, it's still hanging in there. If you don't understand it, don't go anywhere near it.
Well, I sort of made the point, and again, copped a bit of flack on this one, on the Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency issue. People used to trade seashells and glass beads too, and they're in the same genre as Bitcoin. Curious, interesting. There are means of transactions for some, but no longer.
Someone said to me, "Would you invest in Bitcoin?" And I said, "Doesn't make any sense."
Yes. Whereas racehorses, and this is just...
so that was my joke for the day. Sense.
No, I got it. Whereas racehorses are a different kettle of fish, to mix my metaphors there. Because, again, maybe that's just a thing that you do with spare money, and in fact I'm sure it is, because they're... a lot of huge interest out of it. But once you buy the racehorse, they're actually relatively cheap to maintain, and this is... apart from the fact that their shoes and dentistry and training fees are moderately high, but if you've got a 5% share in a racehorse, it's cheaper than owning a cat.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I do know a Melbourne Cup winner actually. He had a very minute.
Which one?
I think it was 2 years ago. I forget the name of the horse.
I know someone's going to have the next 2 Melbourne Cup winners, and that's me. So
he
watch out for Hotel Amour.
He had the 2% share, and because he used to work at Bloomberg. So I'm not telling you anything. I think I signed my confidentiality contract, and so he left Bloomberg on the Friday, and then on the Tuesday he was celebrating a Melbourne Cup victory. So there we go.
Well, gambling's been big in the news this week. Dan, what are your Super Rugby tips for this year? I know Mr. Pascoe will be tuning in for his tips.
Michael Pascoe, the patron saint of business journalists. On rugby, I'm going to say New Zealand teams 5, Australian teams, if they're not playing each other, 0. Look, no, on a serious note, a reduction in, I will say New South Wales will be the team to beat, but generally speaking, if there's one organisation which could use a big pick-me-up and a change of fortune, it's the ARU. Otherwise, it's just been, the last year was horribilis, so to speak. So that's what I'm hoping for. New South Wales or Queensland to really come through.
Yeah, well, on crypto, I mean, I think it's been a good swing trade, as you said, for some people in recent weeks. If you understand it, if you understand the liquidity, and if you're cognizant of the new supply, to me, I don't understand it, but maybe for some people with a portion of their money.
Look, I mean, this thing called the blockchain, and it's like, I've read into it. It's, I think it's got another iteration to go, but it's one of those things like, you know, but it's that herd mentality. I mean, like you speak to people all the time, and they said, well, it's just the same as the financial markets. This is where financial markets, they don't sell themselves that well as professionals. They have this terrible image of guys with silly coloured jackets that, you know, that punt. And I think that kind of hangover effect has kind of gone into that whole cryptocurrencies, you know, like make millions. This guy, and then of course the news flow doesn't help at all. The national broadcaster, I believe, provides the Bitcoin price, and you're going, the gold price, the oil price, are still the ones that
never mention government bonds. They never mention the bond yield, which of course is the dominant market in the world.
They're the things that underpin everything, and they move the needle everywhere. They govern inflation ultimately. You know what I mean? And so that's, I just kind of think that's the hangover effect of an industry which we've all kind of had loose association with, that just doesn't, you know. It markets itself as a cowboy one. I think that's spilled into the whole crypto sphere, if I was to make an observation.
Well, speaking of the hangover effect, Dan, you're a Brisbane boy. Where are we going for dinner?
We are going, I'm thinking if I can get my shoes fit on me, I think we should go maybe down to Fridays and be in the Brisbane Riviera.
Paris of Asia.
Brisbane is the Paris of Asia. But, I think we're going to have a couple of beautiful cold cleansing vinos, refreshments.
I'm not sure you'll get in with those same shoes on, Dan, but we'll see how we go. Guys, it's been great to
Fantastic,
chat. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to catching up in due course.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, mate.